Hi, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Let me go ahead and welcome our panelists onto the stage. In order of, I think, Ernest, you're going to be next to me, Justine, you're in the middle, and then Lisa, you're on the end there. Okay. Happy to kick off here. So I'm Adrienne Lindgren. I am the Senior Vice President of Unlocking Innovation at the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator. This is a topic that has been close to my heart as I spent the last few years in the advanced air mobility space prior to moving to Lacey this year. But pleased to introduce today's panel, The Sky's the Limit, Bridging the Gap from Theory to Practice. We're going to talk a little bit about advanced air mobility. Out of curiosity, as a show of hands, is everyone familiar with what advanced air mobility is? No? Okay. AAM, Advanced Air Mobility, is an air transport system concept that integrates new transformational aircraft design and flight technologies into existing and modified airspace operations. So advanced air mobility covers a few different aircraft typologies. Generally, themes are automation powered by electric or hybrid powertrains, small UAS, unmanned aircraft systems, all the way up to eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landing systems. These are all aircraft that are covered under the topic of advanced air mobility. And this is all going to be regulated under the FAA and in the national airspace, both existing and modified airspace. So I wanted to give some quick background there on what the topic of today is and what the technology scope is, and let Liza go on about that as well. If you guys could each give us a little bit of background on your name, your role, your organization, and how you work with AAM.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Ernest Huffman. I'm with North Central Texas Council of Governments. We're the Dallas-Fort Worth's Metropolitan Planning Organization, and I manage our aviation planning and education program area. Over the last, I want to say, 7 years or so, we've been working within our region to integrate all manner of unmanned aviation technologies, and that's inclusive of advanced air mobility. We got a few centers of gravity in that particular industry. One big thing, we're pushing for operations for World Cup 26. We have some freight applications, some medical use applications, as well as some airport shuttle-related applications we're looking into as well.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Justine Johnson. I serve as Chief Mobility Officer for the state of Michigan. I lead the Office of Future Mobility and Electrification, and some of the work that we're doing within Michigan with advanced air mobility. We've created an AAM activation fund for companies who are looking to test and deploy new ideas and solutions around drone development and as well as infrastructure. So we do have a funding program that's available to support that work. We do have a program, and we'll talk a little bit, I'm sure, in the Q&A, a program called Flight Forward Launchpad for Innovative Technology, and that's in partnership with the Gerald R. Ford Airport and Southwest Airlines.
Good morning. My name is Liza Josias. I lead global ecosystem development for Eve Air Mobility. Eve is a spin-off of the world's third largest aircraft manufacturer, Embraer. We're building an electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. At launch, it will be piloted. We're also building a digital air traffic management solution to help integrate aircraft in an agnostic way into the low-level airspace. And we also have a suite of aftermarket services. So we're looking at supporting the aircraft from beginning to during operations and as an aftermarket aftermarket service. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. This is a great panel today, a lot of diverse perspectives, so appreciate you all joining us. Liza, to take it back to you, can you ground us a little bit as the sort of OEM rep on the panel? Got a sense of what the sort of technology scope and offering is. How are you looking at entry into service timelines, the different kinds of use cases that you're thinking about serving with your tech?
Yes, so the electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL market, is evolving rapidly. We're expecting to see the first models approved and certified by the FAA in the next year or two. And then rapidly thereafter, there'll be other market entrants. So the first operators will probably be looking for certification in either the Middle East or the United States. In the United States, there is a lot of momentum and excitement about this, where there are a lot of different use cases, potentially from sightseeing to airport shuttles to commuter uses. So there are different customers with different plans. In Eve, we have United Airlines as one customer. They have letters of intent for 400 aircraft. So they could potentially be using these aircraft to take people from an airport somewhere close to their home. So instead of driving an hour home, being in traffic, you could be potentially flying that in 10 minutes. So we're looking to prepare the airspace, the land, the power infrastructure, and also the digital infrastructure that's going to bring that all together. And that airspace, the land infrastructure, the digital infrastructure has to include everybody. It has to include the drones in that airspace doing deliveries. It has to make sure that it's not having a detrimental effect on the safety of the airspace today with commercial aircraft. So there's a lot to consider, and we're excited to be doing testing and driving concepts and really engaging with different communities to understand what they want, to understanding concerns from different air traffic management, local airports. And so there are a lot of voices to take into account, but we hope to be able to do it right and make this work effectively, because we see there are a lot of community benefits from mobility to maybe workforce development and new jobs in roles that probably don't even exist today.
It's amazing. Thank you. Justine, Ernest, I'm curious. So, the advanced air mobility industry encompasses a lot of different tech scopes in a certain sense. And there's also been, I think, with any innovative technology deployment, there are sort of different communicated timelines over time. There are different sort of stages of the tech deployment and development, from piloting, testing, to actual commercial operations. I'm curious how the two of you, being kind of in the public sector, how have you managed expectations or engaged with the industry effectively, knowing that there are some uncertainties still?
So yeah, I think that's a great question in terms of how we engage with not only just community, but also industry. I think a lot of the work that we are doing specifically with our pilot programs is something that's really helpful to demonstrate where things are. And like I mentioned before, we have a test site with the Gerald R. Ford Airport, and this is just a really great opportunity for the FAA to also see what is happening within an airport setting. And I believe it's one of the first and probably only test sites that we have within a designated FAA space, which is, again, at that airport. It is helpful because we have a number of partners in Michigan who are folks in academia as well, and connecting our students, but also our R&D community to a lot of the work and advancements that are happening within the state of Michigan. So that part is really important, that we communicate those needs. But also we see the opportunities from defense too. We have a number of different defense players within the state. So there are many stakeholders who are involved in this dialogue and conversation, in making sure that we're hearing from them. We do have an AAM stakeholder meeting that we host, so we do these pretty much on a quarterly basis, where we are hearing from the industry, and at the same time we're articulating the state's needs, especially when we talk about jobs, especially when we talk about our goals, which is really de-risking the infrastructure and making sure that the infrastructure is safe and it's reliable. I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges and concerns, is that community members may fear, is this technology actually safe? What are truly the applications that we can deploy across the state? What might those use cases look like? And when we were creating the AAM Activation Fund, and again, this is our first time we've ever done something like this in partnership with the Michigan Department of Transportation, we really thought about the infrastructure being one important part of the funding. So making sure that we were talking about electrification of the infrastructure throughout the state. And so there are multiple airports that will be investing in charging infrastructure at the airport, but then at the same time we started to think about, okay, well, what are the use cases that we're hoping to accomplish? So partnerships with Munson Health to think about rural health and medical delivery utilizing drones. Also looking at marine testing utilizing drones. So that's another type of use case. We're also doing work on the freight side, where we're having a conversation with the St. Sue's. This is essentially the Upper Peninsula. There's two peninsulas in the state of Michigan, Upper Peninsula and kind of mainland or Lower Peninsula, and really utilizing drones as a ship-to-shore delivery application. So we're very intentional about the use cases. It's not just like we're saying, hey, drones, just put them out there. We have desired goals of really looking at the state and activating areas with drone technology for those use cases and communicating what's going on with those pilots with community. So I think we're very clear on what we want to do with this drone technology, and understanding we're at various phases. It's not all going to be happening at one time, but as long as we're, again, communicating with our stakeholders, academic partners, community stakeholders, it's very important. And the FAA, we cannot leave them out of this conversation, because they're very important, especially as we talk about beyond visual line of sight operations as well.
Awesome. Yeah, Ernest, I was going to turn over to you.
Our region in the DFW region, we're pretty unique. I think we, maybe LA, have been engaged with the advanced air mobility industry probably since its inception. We've been engaged since for the last 7 years or so, and it started with the Uber Elevate movement, where they came to town and they got us all motivated in thinking about advanced air mobility, and it was urban air mobility at the time, right? But because of that particular deal fell through, my region is particularly jaded in terms of engaging and investing in the technology at this particular moment. So the way I've been managing expectation is letting the funding guide our steps. So we're waiting for federal funding and state-related funding to invest in the infrastructure. And I'm telling all my stakeholders to wait on those particular moments unless you had a viable business case that was relevant to your needs today, then you can go ahead and invest. And the reason why we're doing it that way is we're trying to manage expectations. We're trying to slow walk this because there's a lot of burnout experience with a lot of folks. We meet, I imagine LA's dealt with this as well, where every eVTOL manufacturer, every software provider, every individual stakeholder in this industry has come to us, presented to us their wares, and tried to sell us their materials or their production, right? And there's a lot of burnout with meeting with all those particular folks. We're trying to manage that expectation, not burn out, and make sure that we're here to meet that particular industry when it happens.
Interesting. I think it's a good perspective. I appreciate you sharing that. And I think you in North Texas, y'all have been doing some with small UAS, yeah, or with. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about kind of operations you're working with the sort of currently available technology as well.
Oh yeah. So in North Texas, big thing, big motivation is we've been designated the FAA's UTM key site. So all drone deliveries are going on. We got maybe 5 to 6 different drone delivery companies operating in North Texas. And it's being driven by Walmart mostly because they want to deploy drone deliveries to 75% of the Metroplex by the end of this year. So every year, every week, a new city comes online with drone deliveries. So we're working with those particular folks to deconflict those drone delivery operations from law enforcement operations, recreational pilot-related operations. We have numerous pilot activities, engagements, low-altitude weather infrastructure-related pilots engaging on that side, too, to help with high-fidelity weather for efficiency for that particular logistics exercises. We've engaged with multiple real estate developers. We have the largest inland port in the nation, one of the largest air cargo airports in the nation with drone delivery. So a lot of momentum on the drone delivery side in North Texas.
Thank you so much for sharing. Liza, actually, I'm going to turn it back to you for a second. As we think about the product that y'all are working in, obviously electric vertical takeoff and landing, passenger-focused, larger, higher altitude, but you also have been very active in airspace sort of management, concepts of operations for airspace. I'm curious, how do you see, I guess, small UAS, the activities going on around drone delivery, et cetera, how does that factor into sort of bridging from theory to practice, and how does that maybe help or not the efforts that you're focused on in terms of commercializing larger aircraft?
Yeah, good question. So I think the small drone industry has actually done a big favor to the introduction of eVTOLs. It's really opened up communities' eyes. It's opened up awareness of what an eVTOL could be. So we do have a lot of work to do in educating people on whether or not these aircraft are going to be piloted or not. But with respect to your question and the concepts of operations, we have taken a very deliberate tact of testing on paper and then testing over a tabletop with many stakeholders. So one of the first concepts that we did was a white paper called Flight Plan 2030. We wrote that back in 2021 on how will air traffic management work. So our perspective is that the UTM systems that are in place today to manage the small drones aren't going to be suitable for electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft because these are going to be piloted and they will have radio communications, voice communications, as aircraft do today. So that's not really going to quite work. So we also need to be extremely cognizant that safety is that key criteria. I mean, nothing is going to happen unless things are safe. So how do we make sure that the airspace is safe, taking into account everybody using that low urban airspace? So our take is that it should be ATM today, scaled down to that city-urban environment. So we did that concept. We tested it with Air Services Australia. We're taking a very human-centered approach. So it's not about let's stick this technology in and see how it works. It's about where are the humans in the system right now? So air traffic management has a lot of work to do. And as any AENSP around the world knows, there is also a workforce shortage. So the idea of pressing any more workforce workload onto ATC is really going to come with limited acceptance. So we've developed a concept called urban air traffic management. We've evolved that into a product called Vector. And Vector is to basically help to coordinate the processes, the resources on the ground and in the air. And the way I like to explain it to people is that, you know, if you're flying from Los Angeles to New York, it might be a 5-hour flight. So if you lose 10 minutes of that, it's not a big deal. A flight across an urban area might be 10 to 15 minutes. And if people are doing, taking that aircraft for really time-sensitive issues like I'm trying to catch a plane, right? And I know there's a lot of traffic. Then that passenger experience, that customer experience is going to be core. And so it's going to really need to coordinate what are the resources on the ground, what are the resources in the air, and then using the digital infrastructure to communicate everything. So we need to be incredibly flexible. So last year I came to CoMotion, and I think there was a fire on Highway 10. And if there was a vertiport near there, that would have been closed. So how is the fire department going to communicate with the service provider or that entities managing that urban airspace to say, that's going to be closed, you need to go to plan B. And so you need to be very dynamic. ATC today is very dynamic. When you look at what happened 9/11, they got everyone on the ground really quickly because you just need to pivot. So how are we going to get that system to understand where are the drones today, what's everybody doing, and sharing that information in real time? So we've done concepts of operations with Australia, and we looked at the ATC human workload and understood where the caps that are going to be triggered when that workload's too much and these aircraft need to hold outside of controlled airspace. And that's a really important question because these aircraft run on batteries. It doesn't have the luxury of being able to hover for a while. So, you know, if they have to hold outside of controlled airspace, that could potentially mean a return to base. So we need to be able to have procedures in space, airspace procedures in space, information exchange with ground providers. Is there a FATA or a landing pad? If you land at LAX today and you were early, I was early, and then we sat there for 30 minutes, so thank you for being early, because there was no gate. So you don't have that luxury at a vertiport, right? So where are these aircraft going to sit if you're early? So we need to have a really tightly choreographed ecosystem of shared data. And that keeps everybody safe, that keeps everybody efficient, provides a more positive body of experience. And recently we tested the software with a helicopter operator in Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is the world's busiest helicopter market. It's insane, like 2,000 helicopter operations per day. And so we tested it with one of our customers. And one of the luxuries that Eve has is that we have customers across 5 continents, so we can really tap into that experience. And it worked really well. And in fact, they thought they could use that software today to manage the resources for understanding where a helicopter is, where it can land. In another simulation we did recently, a helicopter went from Farnborough in the UK to the centre of London, not realising that that heliport was closed. So what did that helicopter do? They return to base. If you have an eVTOL, I don't think you've got that luxury. So we really need to know what's going on the air and the ground and the land, and also the power system all at the same time. So those concepts of operations, we've been looking at the airspace, the eVTOL operations, the passenger experience, and helps us to really learn from the wild instead of some sort of a theoretical paper exercise.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think to ground, because a couple of terms came up that I'll just remind us of. So air traffic control being ATC, right? So aviation is a highly federated system, right? It occurs generally within airports. The national airspace is tightly regulated by the FAA and managed by the FAA. I think one of the interesting elements of activating low altitude airspace is this need for sort of a tight choreographing of the ecosystem and of stakeholders. Back in the day, I was on the FAA Drone Advisory Committee, and the state and local question of integration has always been an interesting one that has been sometimes challenged to get resolved. I'm curious, since we do have, and I know this wasn't our prep questions, but I'm going to go ahead and roll with it. Since we do have someone from a state entity and also a local and regional entity, what are, maybe a 2-part question, what do you need in order to feel confident activating that low altitude airspace, i.e., do you need coordination from the FAA? Do you need it from industry? Some combination of both? And what have maybe proven to be effective methodologies for engaging with what has been a pretty federated system as we think about bringing it down to sort of city and regional governments?
Yeah, I'll start first. I think in terms of what we need, I think the infrastructure is one piece, making sure that the infrastructure is accessible, available, and especially when we talk about the difference between vertiports, but also when we think about drone delivery, that may not look like a vertiport. That may look like a privatized resource. How do we think about communications in this regard? We understand that we don't want unnecessary traffic in our airways, and we want to make sure that it's safe wherever a drone may be picking up. But again, in the future, what that might look like for eVTOL, especially when you think about the future of moving people in the airspace as well. That also will require lots of coordination with FAA. I know that there are a few waivers that are being under consideration right now, so we want to make sure that whatever we are doing is in full alignment and compliance with FAA's guide in terms of managing and regulating the airspace. So we want to, of course, make sure that that's paramount. Safety, of course, is key to the success of this industry. But I would also say interoperability. So as there are a number of different companies that are looking to deploy new technologies and solutions, how might they all work together? And it can't just be a conversation of what is happening in the air. It has to connect with what's going on land as well, on the ground. So making sure that there is that true seamless flow of information, but connectivity, as I think about moving people, how might eVTOLs complement existing public transit networks? Where are there transit deserts right now, and how might eVTOL be a solution here? And it may or it may not be. And I think just having that clarity there. So I would say for me, the top pieces are really going to be that communications, it's going to be interoperability, and it really is going to be on the infrastructure. And as well as we think about, efficiency and zero emissions reality, like making sure that however we're moving people or goods, that we continue to focus on a zero emissions goal. And so that's going to be really important. And lastly, I always say this because I think we talk about technology a lot, and we sometimes have a conversation that's completely missing people. And so for me, I always make sure that we're talking about jobs, we're talking about how people are going to be able to connect to this, what is the true user experience that people will have. I just don't want to have a world where we see additional inequities in our built environment, and as well as in the airspace as well, making sure that this is an accessible resource for people of all different incomes, and as well as abilities, physical and mental abilities, but also what might this mean for someone in terms of tapping into this industry and really looking at the future of their career today, but also in the future. So those are some key areas that are really important that we look at as a state.
Awesome. Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off of that, I think one of the main needs one of the main issues we're having with implementing the technology is federal regulations. We need that advisory circular on vertiport design. We need that ASAP. Without that, I'm reticent to tell any of my airports to invest in a vertipad, vertiport technology, because you just don't know what's going to change from a standards perspective once that that advisory circular is dropped. So we need that in place. Another piece is, and I mention that because we live in the most litigious nation in the country. We don't want to put something in place where somebody can get sued, and they sue a lot in Texas. So we want to make sure that that is in place. Another piece is the funding. I mentioned earlier, we're slow walking it because there's no federal funding programs out there. The state of Texas isn't currently funding anything. We don't fund infrastructure as a practice anyway. So without a federal funding mechanism, we just really need the FAA or the Department of Transportation to invest in these technologies just to make it viable. Outside of that, our business interests, those business entities, they can invest till they're blue in the face because they can operate as long as they're not a federally funded entity. But without those regulations in place, we're not going to be doing much in terms of vertiport, vertipad development in North Texas.
I'd have to imagine staff time alone, right? If you think about different departments that have to be mobilized, becomes sort of its own pain point unless the funding becomes available.
I mean, in developing the ecosystem, the infrastructure, every conversation ends up with the term chicken and egg, right? And it's like chicken, egg, we can't design this until there's that. It's like what Ernest just said, we can't design the vertiport until the policy's in place. And I find a lot of that chicken egg. It evolves and then we start again. But where it really starts is that stakeholder engagement stage. So there's a lot of talk about the infrastructure, or how are we going to get the charges up, how are we going to get the power companies ready. But it really starts with the stakeholders, and by that I mean the industry, the government, and the community, right? So I think there's also an opportunity here for us to think beyond that transportation mindset and look at the people. So going back to the simulations that we did in Chicago, we had a hospital system that was across the street from the vertiport in Chicago. And we explained what eVTOLs are. And then they said, this would be a total game changer for us because we can start moving our clinicians around the whole region in much more efficient ways rather than have this, 6-month waiting list before you can see a cancer specialist or something like that. Now we can have that person maybe, be at a clinic in the morning in one place, and instead of requiring them to drive 2 hours across in terrible traffic, we can fly them over to the other hospital and maybe perform treatment or do whatever, basically serve more people instead of having that time being constrained by mobility. So I think if we can look at maybe funding with Department of Health and Human Services in the cities, how can we get chemo patients to their appointments sooner and in a less stressful way? We're going to see immediate benefits right there. And so let's be creative rather than taking that assumption that this is going to be for rich people flying over us. How else can we use it in a much more meaningful, effective way?
Well, maybe in speaking about meaningful and effective ways, I think about the legacy aviation system and the airport system, right? And sort of aviation over time, we had sort of a decrease in service, particularly around small airports, where you had high impact tech. The aircraft got bigger, they got louder, they got more pollutive. And a lot of those airports, which were economic development institutions frequently in communities, sort of became deactivated over time or reappropriated to other uses. And I'm curious for sort of everyone's experience working with airport systems. I know you've got an FAA sort of designated airport and airspace that you're working in and testing. How are they looking at this tech in terms of asset utilization and being engaged in the system?
Yeah, I'll speak to just, again, 2 of our projects. And I think this is something that is, I hope you all are understanding, something that is very unique about Michigan, especially when we talk about funding for infrastructure and funding for pilot demonstrations. That's, again, as you hear from my counterpart over here in Texas, right, it's not there right now. Maybe later y'all get it. But, right now we're really focusing on making sure that we are strengthening our relationship, especially with our stakeholders on the ground, and as well as those who are our regulators as part of the FAA. So as part of this very new fund, that's the AAM Activation Fund. We literally issued, I want to say it was $6.25 million this past May to 4 different entities across the state of Michigan. And this is, again, not only is it just a conversation about the funding, but what this means in terms of advancing the infrastructure. So Beta Technologies is a company that we worked with, for example, who's received grant funding, and they're building out charging infrastructure. This is beyond just a conversation about charging infrastructure for drones and for aircraft, but also what are the applications as it relates to electrification of vehicles, ground transportation vehicles as well. What are these dual-use purposes that we can get out of this infrastructure investment? Same can be said, as I think you were hinting to the conversation around really thinking about the people who are using this. And so we have a partnership, again, another company that received funding is working in collaboration with Munson Health, which is a rural health provider in the state of Michigan. We are literally thinking about how we can think about lab tests very differently. So how might someone who lives in a rural community who has to travel such a long distance, how might they get to a point where they can get their lab work done in a matter of minutes instead of a matter of days, right? And so you think about how might you shorten that efficiency. But this is a broader economic development conversation around the state. As we get more interest from companies who are looking to build out the technology, bringing them and attracting them to Michigan is very important. This activation fund had a number of different companies from around the world who were looking to deploy new technologies and ideas. Every company, who applies for funding, some will make it to the next phase and some will not, and that's a part of the economic development investment here. But we want to make sure that the strong players are here. We're thinking about the value chain. Who will build the drones of today and of the future? What will that full supply chain look like? That's a big part of this conversation and discussion. How might we continue to really take advantage of a lot of these activities that are happening in our state to really think about how we're going to move, again, goods, people, information a lot quicker and more efficiently, and as well as what does that mean as a revenue driver across the state. So for us, this term of mobility and advanced air mobility is a part of a broader ecosystem play and how we're continuing to invest in the infrastructure and as well as deployments.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'll highlight, I think, to make available state funding, I think especially at airports, for those who don't know, airport improvement projects are not easy to come by. There's a limited number of funds available. It's a highly federated, very competitive source of funding. And there's a lot of prioritization, right? There's a lot of urgent needs for airports. So those capital improvement projects, for things like electrification can be really, really challenging to kind of get into the queue and activate. So I think it's great to hear that the state is getting engaged in that. I'm happy to open that up.
Yeah, and in our state, the state of Texas only provides $10 million on average for airport funding from the state of Texas. We get the rest from the federal government, and it's not enough, in particular for our general aviation airports, to do the stuff they want to do. But to answer the main question, we've been educating our airports for the last few years on advanced air mobility. So the majority of them, if they're undergoing a master planning effort, they got advanced air mobility facilities on their ALP drawing sets today to accommodate that facility need later on down the line. We have been, and I mentioned the grant funding piece, so we have worked a few federal grants. We got one Department of Transportation SMART grant with the city of Fort Worth, where we were running low altitude weather sensors for advanced autonomous transportation. So that's advanced air mobility technologies as well as autonomous freight technologies on the ground. One of the big pushes I'm doing in North Texas is because I mentioned we don't fund a lot of aviation infrastructure or aviation related projects in the state of Texas, but surface transportation gets tons of money in Texas. We're the land of highways. So there's tons of money on the highway side of things, on the surface transportation side of things, and we're trying to find innovative ways to tap into that funding source. A lot of states have been able to do that, but as a local entity, it's a little tougher. So we went after the Department of Transportation SMART grant. It's an intermodal facility at Alliance International Airport, one of the largest air cargo airports in the country. It's ran by Ross Perot Jr. And what we're doing there is we're having an autonomous truck port. We won $80 million, an $80 million infra grant from, I can't remember the specific agency to build this smart truck port. It's going to be a multimodal facility where you have autonomous freight moving in as a logistics center, as well as autonomous aircraft moving logistics. We plan to start construction on an auto port and integrate these AAM technologies in that particular region. Another push is for, and I mentioned earlier, our World Cup Games 2026. We got 9 matches in the Arlington Entertainment District, and we're going to run an airport shuttle use case where we're doing flights from the DFW Airport to the Entertainment District, as well as Arlington Municipal Airport to the Entertainment District. But all of those will be funded by various grants that we're able to go after. Some of the city will self-fund some of those components. We got some World Cup funding that's attached to it, and we're stringing all of this together.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
So I love the fact that you brought up ground transportation, because one of the really high-ranking requirements is that, UAM has to integrate into the ground infrastructure. It has to be part of a multimodal system. So accelerating that process could really be done, I think, by integrating with the train systems. Train networks usually have an enormous amount of power already put into there. And so that would help the city sort of accelerate that electrification, that decarbonization strategy where, okay, let's bring eVTOLs in, get people to, a bit closer to their final destinations. And maybe at the other vertiport, the other end, now you've got some bike racks or autonomous little buses around there. So I think if we can look at what resources already exist, rather than buying into this vision of these shiny new vertiports with lots of glass and everything, let's get real and make day one, a simple road to get there instead of having to reinvent the wheel for a new substation, and then figure out, okay, how can we then scale from there? Because one of the biggest critical paths and barriers is the power preparation, the utility time. We've had some utility companies say, well, where you want to put a vertiport is going to really differentiate between whether you're going to wait 6 months for power or 2 years for power. If you're on this side of the road, it might be 2 years because that's the line where the utility companies stop, have some sort of a differentiation. So if we can work with multimodals, integration, that really brings jobs and mobility and workforce development into a way that's meaningful and relevant to the local communities.
Yeah, and I didn't mention in that smart port area, we do have significant rail. BNSF is operating there. So significant rail, I mentioned the autonomous freight. So imagine 18-wheelers that are autonomous and driverless on the highways. And all of that will integrate in one multimodal center in the future. Obviously, it's down the line. And we're very excited about that particular prospect of integrating these new technologies.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just want to understand, I mean, these are really, really creative ways to approach this particular industry, I have to say. I mean, I've been in this space for a really long time, and it does take a lot of creativity to figure out how do you localize aviation. And so I really, really respect all the hard work that's being done in both geographies. Really appreciate you sharing. Before we open it up to Q&A, because we've got about 10 minutes left, I wanted to ask, you brought up FIFA, World Games, or World Cup, and we've got Olympics coming up in 2028 in LA. And, you know, I think there has been different points in time. We had the Olympics here in LA in 1984, where we had some technology that was really adopted downstream that was showcased at the Olympics. There are good opportunities. There are sort of pros and cons, right, of showcasing or using World Games as an opportunity to showcase innovation. I'm curious if the three of you could speak a little bit to your thoughts about using mega events for showcasing innovative technology, and then specifically if you see any sort of particular pros and cons for AAM, since I think it comes up frequently in the context of some of these big international games.
Well, for me, it's having that captive audience of World Cup games is a big opportunity to debut aviation technologies. And because I work in aviation outreach, my main thing is exposure of our industry to the masses. So as soon as we got the announcement that we were going to get the World Cup games, I immediately geared towards doing some AAM operations for those particular games, because we just felt we're in the Arlington area is one of those cities that are already using numerous transportation technologies, autonomous people movers. They don't have a transit system, so they use on-demand transit services through app services. So they're using micromobility services. We got drone delivery there, robot deliveries there, and that's one of those forward-looking cities they want to be able to show off their city. And in the state of Texas, I mentioned earlier, we got 44 cities, a population of 50,000 or more, and they're all significant. They're very competitive in terms of the technologies they're debuting. So we imagine when we do these World Cup games and we debut this new technology, every other city who has a budget and who's tech forward, like the Friscos, Planos, Fort Worths, Dallases, they're all going to want to jump in on the opportunity to take advantage of the technology, because that's just how competitive our particular region is with technology. So, what was your question again?
Yeah, I think you answered it.
Because I was just
Is there a pro, con? Is it a good
and the
idea?
cons, though. The cons for major events, and we just learned this for the Paris Olympic Games. They had a big AAM demonstration scheduled. What was the airline again?
This is with Volocopter, I think.
With Volocopter. And all of us, industry, we were all waiting to see that. We were hopeful that this would be a success because we wanted to piggyback off of that momentum. But that went down in flames. They weren't able to fly. The French government wasn't behind the operation. The weather didn't cooperate with the event, and it went down in flames. And subsequently, and it's looking like Volocopters, they're having issues rolling out their technology in Europe. We don't want to have that happen here in the States, and we want to guard against that. And that's gonna. I think that's causing the industry to take a step back.
I didn't want to say it, but yeah, tough week for Volocopter. Tough summer for Volocopter, but you love them anyway.
I would say, the opportunities when it comes to demonstrating technology at large events where there's lots of people, I think is telling a bigger story, right? And I think the story here is when we think about safety, I think about large events where imagine drones are literally watching essentially, from the area of, thousands of people being in a particular place. Imagine law enforcement being more informed, not again surveillance, but just intelligence. There's the distinction between the two. Really understanding, are there any issues or threats that may be happening when you think about crowd management and crowd control, and how drones can quickly detect and spot an issue and quickly get first responders or law enforcement to quickly handle a situation rather than, people just being dispersed. And you think about about staffing, people just being dispersed and not really understanding where might there be some challenges or vulnerabilities, but being able to quickly react. Same thing can be said for, I think about, how you're moving goods when you have large events, right? And so I think about the Olympic Games, right? And all of the different parts and pieces that'll have to be moved, and can a drone actually do that? And I'm not saying, you're gonna be moving hockey equipment from one point to the next, or a surfboard, no. But you might think about the water bottles, you might think about the towels, you might think about all of these small pieces that, imagine if there were trucks that you could get off the road and you can move them via a drone. That's another great example in telling that story of how many trucks or cars did you remove off the road to move those critical supplies and pieces that support a lot of the players, and as well as just the operations of the game. So I think there's the safety piece, and as well as the, again, getting goods from point A to point B. Also building inspections. How do you think about inspecting all of your sites? Can drones actually help you? And we look at this for use cases within Michigan as, building efficiency. So when you think about the building efficiency, how might you then say, we'll disperse X number of drones, we'll check the buildings to make sure everything's functioning correctly, and then you continue to proceed with your operation. So there's a lot of great use cases. I think, again, the cons here is if you're not in full coordination with a number of stakeholders, you will have that moment where people say, no, we're not doing this. And weather is another important considering factor. And you think about microclimates. You may take off in one place that may be beautiful sunny skies, and you may be trying to land somewhere where there's gusty winds, and it doesn't allow for you to land the way in which you took off. So I think those are just challenges that we'll continue to work throughout the industry. But I think there's many pros, as well as when we talk about bringing people into the story about how drones and UAS systems can be used for large sporting events as well.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, but I think we can go a little bit over. Is there anything you want to add before I open to Q&A?
I just wanted to say I agree with Justine in that for big events, first of all, it needs to be practiced. It can't be that showtime when we haven't really learnt how that whole system works, right? And that's when I keep on going back to that digital infrastructure, that digital glue. And the other thing too is that stakeholder engagement, understanding that value. So instead of saying, here's an aircraft, here's our new shiny tech, isn't it cool? I think if we can help to contextualize that and get that local government buy-in as well. I think that was one of the fallbacks from, or the lessons learned from Paris of that operator I shall not name, where we really need to understand local governments are going to take an outsized role in this. Local governments aren't used to talking about aviation, so we need to bring them to the table early and then have them understand what the potential benefit is. So if it's taking an injured athlete off the field and then taking them to the hospital more quickly, that has a value, right? Someone having a heart attack in the stadium and taking them out quickly, that has a value. So how can we use it and not just, have this spotlight on this new shiny toy? I think that would be helpful in a major event like that.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to open it up in case anyone has any questions from the audience to ask our panelists today.
So I was very curious about the rural concept of using drones. I work in Indian Health, and a lot of our elders, folks, they might be going through chemotherapy, have complications with their health. How is it possible, well, because this concept is very new to me, to take the patient from point A to point B in a mountainous area, windy area? Those are the kind of climates that I work in.
I can take this one. So what we're doing in Michigan right now, this is, again, I was mentioning a partnership that we have with Munson Health, which is one of the largest rural health providers in the state. We're actually focusing not necessarily on transporting the person, but transporting whether that's vaccines, whether they have to do a lab test, getting their lab tests and essentially once the lab test is completed, putting that in the drone and moving it that way. So we're starting with the critical supplies and really understanding the like lab tests, for example, of that piece of the medical health conversation. We are not yet at the phase where we're talking about transporting a person. So that's the distinction there. We've done a lot of research, and I will share with you that I co-authored a white paper with someone from the Royal Aeronautical Society, and we literally looked at applications from developing nations and how they are utilizing drones for the social benefits of people. So you're seeing in other places, in India, for example, how drones are being used to get vaccines to community members, and they've been doing this for a while, actually. This is not new for them, but they're thinking about how do you get those critical vaccines to people who may live in locations that are mountainous, that may live in locations that are, susceptible to heavy rains and flooding. So the main arterial roads are shut down, and really thinking about how those supplies work. So there's so many interesting applications. Also, agriculture is another important part. When you think about what a farmer has to do on a regular basis, is not only just maintaining their crops, but also protecting their crops from any types of pests. And so how might drones actually be used to look and inspect the crops, and if there is an isolated issue, then send your drones to do spraying and treatment of that particular area. So there are many interesting use cases, especially from a rural perspective and rural community building, that really has the drones for good and drones for society as well.
I'll sort of add to that one. So there are lessons that we can take from other countries in looking at the health use case for helping people who live in more remote areas. In Norway, they are actually subsidizing the price of the tickets for people who live in, say, a remote area like an island. So Norway has a lot of islands. And they sort of did the numbers, and they find that it's cheaper to pay for the ticket for someone to fly from an island to the nearest town for the clinic than it is to have to build a clinic in every one of those remote places, and then to hire staff, all equipment and everything. And so, I think there are opportunities for us to look at these geographically challenging areas where if we can fly them, at launch, eVTOLs will have a range of about 60 miles. That might be enough to take you to the nearest train station or something where maybe that's from that point on, it's an efficient way to get your treatment. So there are opportunities, I think, to work with Health and Human Services and explore creative ideas to implement these new technologies.
And I'll also add one more piece to that is organs, right? And so when we think about right now, when critical organs, someone has to get a heart transplant or whatever organ needs to get to point A to point B, a lot of times that is an ambulance that's rushing through traffic, getting that organ to the person in enough time. And imagine where you can start to think about that in a more coordinated effort, where you're getting those organs to the hospitals, and vice versa, getting that organ to a patient who is in dire need. Gabriella, I know you had your hand up.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I really appreciate how the discussion has really changed in the last 2 years, of how industry's not leading the discussion with getting out of traffic, but rather the decision makers, the policy makers, and seeing Eve in particular take a stand of public benefits being at the forefront and social equity in this new technology. I think that's a really big component to bring forward advanced technology into government, particularly when you're blending locales that normally don't coexist, like aviation, transportation, and land use in the shared space. And so I just want to applaud the fact that we're turning a corner on this, and it warms my heart to see this message being unified across all of our entities and across different jurisdictions that we normally don't have a lot in common. And so it's lovely to see this advancement in this new space.
So, couldn't have said it better myself. I have to say, I've been working in this space since 2016 before pivoting back into the broader clean tech landscape. And the conversation has evolved so tremendously, really thanks to a lot of the leadership from folks like yourselves and taking creative approaches and creative ways to engage stakeholders. So I know we're just about up on time. So I want to give a nice round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining today, and thanks for the thoughtful questions, and looking forward to seeing what comes next. Thank you.